Let's meet our panelists. She is the host of Congressional Dish, making her first appearance on Bad Faith, Jennifer Briney.
Hello, thank you for having me.
With us, making his, 18th appearance on Bad Faith. We should give him a key at this point. He is the executive editor of the American Prospect, Dayen. Welcome back.
All right, thanks for having me.
I'm really excited to have you both here because it's been a while since we did a policy deep dive episode. And as Virgil just mentioned, David, you are one of our go-to policy experts. But Jennifer, you are a newer find for me personally, although I know you've been at this work for a long time. And part of why I really like and appreciate your approach is that you are coming to it from the perspective of, as you say, an everyday taxpayer. Can you introduce yourself to our audience, some of whom might not be familiar with you?
Sure. So I started doing this podcast back in 2012 because I was watching C-SPAN and was reading bills and laws in my free time because that's a normal thing to do. And I just wanted people to know what I was finding out. So for instance, one of the, moments for me that made me realize that there was stuff going on in Congress we didn't know about is that there was a amendment slipped into an energy and water bill that was protecting secret campaign contributions. And it was Representative Tom Cole of Oklahoma who did it and who actually went on the House floor and on C-SPAN bragged about doing it. So that evening, I turned on TV expecting someone to talk about it, and Rachel Maddow didn't talk about it. No one on CNN was talking about it. And then the real wake-up call for me is then I went on the internet and I couldn't find anything, not so much as a blog, nothing. And so I started wondering, how often does this happen? And the more I started reading the laws and watching hearings, I was finding out so much about our role in the world and what was happening and how our laws were changing that I just didn't feel like I could find anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so I started creating the podcast that I couldn't find. And so here I am, I think 9 years later, still doing it. I've learned a lot of lessons. But my shtick in the beginning was for the first 2 years, I read every bill that passed the House of Representatives.
Wow.
Which I know, I thought it should be possible. In fact, what I really wanted to do in the beginning was look at the schedule for the week, read the bills, tell people what was in them so that by Friday, by the time they actually voted, I could tell you this is what they're voting on. It just seemed like such a basic thing to do. And then I learned the hard way that, they're not reading these bills and laws and they can be thousands of pages long. And so I've just had this education out loud for the last 9 years. And so now I'm just looking at whatever topics are interesting to me. The two bills laws, I should say, that I always read are government funding and the National Defense Authorization Act. And then, anything else that I feel like needs to be read and isn't being covered adequately.
So I just finished listening to your NDAA episode. It's fabulous. I learned a lot. And part of what I like about your approach is that you don't assume knowledge. And I found as a journalist and as a consumer of news, that would be a very frustrating thing for me when I was editing somebody else's piece, reading something else, and I found I had to click down a series of hyperlinks to understand the thing that they were talking about in the article. And I think when a lot of folks find news to be inaccessible or particular areas of the news, let's say foreign policy, things that are historically rooted, that might be outside of an individual's expertise, it can be really daunting. And you tend to build that into your episodes in a way that I think make them very accessible. And so I just want to say props to you for that. And props to you for having the chutzpah to kind of dive into an area that a lot of people feel like, you need a certain amount of credentialism or there's a lot of gatekeeping around. And as a consequence, these subjects just go uncovered. David, I want to ask you, because we are coming up on the first 100 days. I've seen you tweeting about a bunch of 100 days events that you're going to be doing. We've got you before the punch. So we're going to get preview. That first 90 odd days.
We had a choice between doing a 420 episode or a first 100 days episode.
I have no idea how I won. I have no idea how we're doing this right now.
Mostly I forgot that it was 420.
Well, it is very appropriate. That's very 420 apt, yes.
So, David, what should be on our radar? There's been a lot of reporting over the past week or so about how Joe Biden has exceeded expectations, how the progressives are apparently very happy with his policy outlook so far. There was a piece by Anand Uradas, who was just on our podcast a couple of weeks ago, that caused a little bit of a brouhaha on the left because some folks didn't feel like it adequately represented the feelings afoot among at least the Twitterati. What's your take?
Well, I think you have to define your terms. So if you're going in and saying that Joe Biden essentially had one job in this first 100 days, and that was to vaccinate the population, he has well exceeded his own self-defined expectations for that. So, initially came out and said, we're going to get 100 shots into arms, 100 million shots into arms in the first 100 days. The final number is going to be something like 225 or 230. So they've more than doubled that. Half of all Americans have at least one shot right now. We've hit as high as 4.5 million per day in certain days. And I think that you can say that if this was the one thing that he had to do for our public health and for our economy, that was a success.
David, how exactly did Biden pull that off?
Well, I think that the Trump administration's conception of a vaccine rollout was, hey, states, here's some vaccine. Enjoy. And the Biden administration did impose some not only some structure on the process, but some actual resources. I mean, there was always going to be a ramp up of how much product the various vaccine manufacturers could put out. So there was always going to be an increase. But the acquisition of, first of all, there was a lot of money in the American Rescue Plan that went toward this purpose. That, I think, was put to use. There are a lot of mass vaccination sites. I guess there's one, right, in New York City at the Natural History Museum under the whale now. There's
directed by Noah Baumbach.
There you go. The federal program to get these things into pharmacies where most Americans live within 5 miles, I think has been successful. So it's just a matter of actually imposing some will on the process, I think, that has made it more successful than the way that the Trump administration was going, which was essentially you're on your own.
So you say if we defined Biden's success by getting vaccines in the arms of people, then he's doing a good job. But I think the issue is that a lot of the left didn't define success in such narrow terms. If you set the bar low, it's, and not to say that isn't an achievement of sorts, but what progressives were saying going into this election season was that COVID exposed a lot of the pretty gross inequities in our system, and people had an expectation that there was going to be a significant shift, not just in COVID response, but in foreign policy, border policy, healthcare policy, immigration policy, all of these things that were under such scrutiny under Donald Trump, because that's what we were told, right? He's the worst president of all time. Joe Biden should present a marked difference. So where are we on some of those other priorities and the other vulnerabilities in our social safety net that the COVID crisis exposed? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think, again, it's about defining terms, right? So the American Rescue Plan passes. The Biden needs to be measured for Mount Rushmore. Biden is FDR crowd really looks at that bill as significant as to the change in mindset. And it is a change in one key area where there was a willingness to do a significant amount of fiscal spending without worrying about deficits. And that is a significant change. And it is important. I mean, you compare this to the 2009 stimulus when Barack Obama got in, and that was very needlessly hemmed in and shrunken and done in a way that minimized its effectiveness. So, you compare those two, yes, there is a change. There have been other areas in which there's been a lot more continuity. I mean, you mentioned immigration. I think the rather shameful disinterest in increasing the refugee cap from 15,000 this year. That could have been done by executive order with a mid-year emergency declaration. Literally all Joe Biden had to do was sign a piece of paper to rescue tens of thousands of refugees all over the world. He decided ultimately not to do it and then got a furious amount of pushback and said, okay, I'll do it next month. And, we'll have to see what happens next month.
Yeah.
But I think that was really an example, almost a throwback example to the Obama days, because he was really, it seemed like the political team was managing that issue, and they were fearing sort of the right's noise machine about runaway immigration coming into the country, which of course they're going to say anyway, no matter what you do. The refugee process, a completely different process as border policy. The two have nothing to do with one another. Refugees are heavily vetted. If you miss the moment of opportunity when you can bring them over, the vetting often has to start all over again. It could take months or even years to get these people out of refugee camps and into this country and beginning to start a better life. That, I think, is a low point for where the Biden administration has gone. So everything else, I think, is along that continuum, right? And we can talk about foreign policy, where you have this promising idea to actually leave Afghanistan, but are you going to keep private military contractors in there? You have this vow to end the Yemen war, but there's been no details, even supplied to members of Congress about that. So there are a lot of questions there. I wrote a piece today about Biden's relationship to corporate power, which is another giant incomplete. There have been a lot of mergers that have gone through under this president. There's a lot of question marks. There were some good hires, people like Lena Khan and Tim Wu, although Lena Khan is not yet in the government. She's awaiting confirmation. But who's going to run the Federal Trade Commission? Who's going to run the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency? Who's going to run the Assistant Attorney General's Office for Antitrust? All of that is up in the air. And, so you can kind of go down the line, and, it's not surprising there's a mix of good and bad here, because we knew that who we elected when we elected him. We knew he wasn't going to be Eugene Debs. And I think a lot of people kind of fooled themselves or tricked themselves into thinking that after one emergency bill passed, then yes, now we have Debs incarnate. Yeah. It remains to be seen if this infrastructure bill is going to get off the ground in the same form as it's been described. As described, it's a fantastic bill, but the devil is in the details, and the devil is in the compromises.
Right.
So anyway, I think a mixed picture.
The devil's in the details is really where you live, Jennifer, because you do these deep dives, which, there's a kind of an ethos among left podcasts where there's a certain coolness to like not try that hard, and there's like this like laid back vibe. And
am I getting called out again?
No, never, Virgil. Not you at all. But I have a lot of respect for the people. There's some people like, Citations Needed. There's some podcasts out there that really put in labor that you can feel. And yours is one of them. So I want to ask you, you having done all that work, you did a deep dive into the COVID bill, the Corona bus. What if you were to pick, because I'm accused sometimes of being overly cynical and hard on Joe Biden, what might people not realize that was in there that surprised you in a positive way?
In a positive way. Well, the thing about the Corona bus that I just don't think that people understand in general is that was government funding. That was standard government funding with the COVID relief attached to it. And so just the COVID relief being in that bill at all, I think that was the most positive thing. But I just, I have a lot of anger about the Corona Bus, just the way the entire government was funded last year. In fact, the entire way that Congress functioned last year, I feel like the vast majority of our representatives weren't involved. And so we have these 12 different sections of government that were all smashed into this giant bill. It was 5,593 pages. And so, of course there were good things in there, with the COVID relief being the best example of that. But the way that that was created, the way that that's done, the way that that's sidelined everyone that we vote for to represent us, it was really done by leadership instead of the people, like my representative wasn't in that room. Most people weren't, unless you're a resident of San Francisco. So, yeah, I actually, off the top of my head.
Well, you don't have to be positive. I was just trying to be good faith for a second. Yeah, sure. David,
Can I jump in there?
Sure.
I mean, we're talking about the December bill. Of course, that was signed by President Trump and passed by a split Congress. But one thing I think is very instructive there, because often what you hear about these bills is, here's what's in them, here's the laundry list, isn't that good and great? People are going to get rescued, people are going to get saved, and things are wonderful. One of the more interesting pieces of the December 2020 bill was a bill called Save Our Stages. And Save Our Stages was a $15 billion program, later increased in the American Rescue Plan to $16.5 billion in grants to venues, whether museums, music clubs, theaters, things like that, independent clubs that have had no revenue whatsoever over the last year plus. And this is the most significant funding for the arts in American history. If you really look at it, it's the $16.5 billion is almost more than the sum total of funding for the National Education Association since its inception. It's a tremendous amount of money comparatively for the arts. However, $0 has actually been delivered to any venue operator so far. This program was put into the hands of the Small Business Administration. They devised this program called the Shuttered Venue Operators Grants Program. They spent 3 months refining the application and coming up with a system to take applications and define eligibility and who gets to get this program and who doesn't. There's an FAQ on the Small Business Administration page with 260 questions in it about eligibility. A totally Byzantine and way of doing this that has no precedent with, for example, the Paycheck Protection Program for other small businesses, and They opened the application process on April 8th at noon. They told the venue operators the night before, we're going to open the process. And this is a first come, first served program. So they tell them 11 hours before, get all your documents together. We're going to open this program at noon. They open the program at noon. Nobody can upload their documents. Nobody can get into the portal. They shut the portal in 4 hours. It has not been reopened. There's now an idea that it's going to be reopened at the end of the week. This is life or death to these venue operators who have been living on second mortgages and jumping into their 401ks and have been promising their landlords, hey, we're supposed to get this money. We passed Save Our Stages and we're going to get grants to pay for our mortgages. And they said, there's a date certain now, April 8th, we're gonna get the money. And then that came and went, and no money has been released. Implementation is absolutely essential. You can talk about all the good policies that you want. If you don't get them done, if you don't get the money into people's hands, in this case, or if you don't get the regulation passed, it doesn't mean anything. It's just words on paper. And since I put out that story, which was last Thursday, talking about this program and how broken it was, there seems to be some forward momentum, and hopefully we will get these music clubs. Because I mean, that's one of the things I miss the most right now in this pandemic age is being able to go see music. And in the absence of this money, not only will clubs go bankrupt, but they'll sell out to Live Nation and they'll sell out to the giants who will then change the fundamentally the way in which artists get paid, the way in which these concerts are promoted and how much ticket prices are and things like that. So implementation is critical. And too often people opining about various administrations overlook that.
One of the things that I noticed when reading that section of the Corona Bus is that that program, like you said, it's for entertainers, save our stages, right? Well, there was one specific group that was left out of that. And even if the program is implemented correctly, won't be allowed to get any money. And that's anything that has anything to do with sex. So strip clubs, any of those places, they're completely left out of it. And there's some lawsuits right now going through the system. But these are also small businesses that are just now being unfairly targeted because of some purity test, which I can't prove exactly what kind of ideology got that slipped in there. But that's exactly what we were talking about with like the devil's in the details. And so there is this other group of stages that are not going to see help no matter what. And it's another one of those things that no one knows about.
Well, what are the aspects of these bills that you covered, Jennifer, that really pops out to me as undercovered are these aspects of the bill that support regime change. And foreign policy is one of the blind spots of a lot of, folks covering the news here. And I'm guilty of that.
I'm not.
Well, Virgil, maybe you can chime in as well then on this episode you did, which was the first one I listened to of yours, Jennifer, all about Belarus. It was mind-blowing. Can you just set the stage a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, buried thousands of pages deep in the Corona Bus was a bill that essentially reauthorizes a regime change effort that's actually been going on for a while in Belarus. Belarus has a president who's been president pretty much my entire life. I'm no spring chicken, so I don't think we can really call that a democracy. But regardless, what this bill did is it took some previous authorizations that we had, which were sanctions against officials in Belarus, and took it a step further, which I was so concerned about, because not only are we now going to sanction people in Belarus, we're also sanctioning people within Russia, in the Russian government, that are supporting the president of Belarus. And then when you look at the funding, it doesn't fund anything for the Department of Defense. So we're not in the war stage of this yet. But it does fund a lot of things in the State Department, which is kind of like the first step of regime change. It's the propaganda efforts. And the way that they funded it was essentially authorizing them to spend as much as they want on this effort. And so when you look at essentially unlimited funding through transfer authorities, and so the State Department has all these different money buckets, and they can move it around at will and put as much as they want into this. You look at unlimited funding, and now we're sanctioning Russian officials. And it just all tied together with me because we now have a president, Joe Biden, who as vice president was one of the key officials in our role in a coup that happened in Ukraine, the next door neighbor to Belarus. And so when I just look at that, and obviously, like David said, this was something that was signed at the end of the Trump administration. But the Congress that created the Corona Bus behind closed doors knew that Joe Biden was going to be the next president. And so that's why I decided to highlight that particular regime change operation, even though there's other ones in there. We're targeting Sudan. We're still going after Venezuela. I mean, there was a whole list of them. But with Belarus and with Joe Biden in particular being president, that's why I felt like it was important to really highlight what was in there, because it was so buried deep and it wasn't in the table of contents either. So it's one of those things that unless you're putting eyeballs on every single page, you're not going to know it's there.
We don't have to do a deep dive into this, but David, you did mention earlier Biden's pullout announcement for Afghanistan, which is something that we have not yet covered on this show. And you brought up a very important point, which is that people like me who have been following this are incredibly cynical and pessimistic about this statement, because we know that, the pullout usually involves a lot of asterisks, such as we're going to leave special forces in there, and we're going to leave private military contractors in there. So essentially, we're still paying for this war. We're still subsidizing this war, but we're not using public employees to do it. So there's not really going to be any more political cost for it.
Right. I mean, I think there are two sides to this. The first is that Usually, what is done to ensure continued forever wars is to say that any pullout will be conditions based on the conditions on the ground. That is actually the primary thing that Joe Biden said. No, that's a recipe for staying forever. We're not going to make this conditions based. We're actually going to leave before September 11th, making it a tidy 20 years in Afghanistan. But you're absolutely right that, and we had a piece on this by a woman named Lauren Woods over at The Prospect called From Endless War to Endless Operations, that makes the point that there is no consideration that we are going to leave Afghanistan to its own devices. There's going to be drone flights. There are going to be private military contractors. There are going to be various counterterrorism operations in place and ready to go. Maybe they're coming in from further off and not from in the country itself, but that is still going to be a feature of the landscape, and that's true in virtually every country that we've maybe we've gotten rid of troops, federal troops, but we continue to have these kinds of operations, and that's a concern that that's become sort of the default response. It's bad enough that we were in Afghanistan for 20 years and Iraq going on 18, and there's no end in sight to that war, by the way. But it's worse that there will be this temptation to continue ongoing operations, just take the words U.S. military off it.
There is Joe Biden has just given us a very big shopping list. $2 trillion infrastructure bill, just announced the, I believe, $1.5 trillion family rescue plan, I believe it's called.
Yeah, I don't think it's been fully announced, but it's we've heard the contours of it, yeah.
And that's in addition to what I've read as variously $700 or $750 billion defense spending bill for this year. David and Jennifer, a question for both of you, either of you. I've heard it variously said that Joe Biden's defense bill is going to be bigger than last year's or smaller than last year's. Which side of the marker is that on?
Well, the request is for more money. And also those numbers are nonsense as far as I'm concerned, because when you look at the defense spending, that's the $700 billion-ish that we're spending. Military construction and veterans is hundreds of billions on top of that. So we also have to keep in mind that when we're building new bases and doing upgrades to these places that we don't even know that we're funding all over the world, that is not funded in that money.
And as Jennifer knows, it also doesn't take into account what is known as OCO, which is Overseas Contingency Operations. And that's the warfighting budget. And often in previous years, OCO has been used as essentially a slush fund, whether to pay private military contractors or to construct military bases or whatever, and they just keep increasing OCO to make the regular military budget look not necessarily as big as it truly is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I do something every year when I read the NDAA. I actually didn't put this in my episode this year, but I add up all of the lines that say classified, and it always adds up to about $80 billion. And just to put that in perspective, the entire Department of Homeland Security, which is something like 22 different agencies, TSA, Coast Guard, it has so many things in it. We fund that with about $40 billion a year. So just in the Defense Department, we're spending twice that in money that they're telling us we're not allowed to know about. We also have to keep in mind that there's a lot of transfer authorities between the Defense Department and the State Department. So there's another bunch of shadow money going back and forth. So when it comes to funding, I think the number is going to go up, but we also have to keep in mind that we don't really know what that number is.
Absolutely.
I think that the administration increased the defense, non-defense discretionary budget and said, look, liberals, you got your increases in everything but defense. We're also going to increase defense, but that's the price you pay. That's the balancing act we're taking. We're just going to increase it all.
We're just opening the wallet and we're giving all the kids, $20.
And these budgets are DOA. The presidential budgets, as a rule, generally are not really listened to very much on Capitol Hill. I guarantee you that more money will be given to the Defense Department than is what is requested. That's been traditionally the course of action, and I suspect that will happen again. So we'll see what the budget ultimately comes out to, and we'll see if they can actually pass a budget. I mean, this could be another in a series of continuing resolutions as we go on, because the budget is something you can't do in budget reconciliation, or at least not all of it. You need Republican votes to pass the budget. So we'll see what happens.
So under Biden, we're looking at, even with unitary Democratic government right now, an increase of the already bloated military budget. Like that's, what reached astronomical levels under Trump, under what is, essentially, putting aside our, engagements in well over a dozen countries, essentially a peacetime military budget.
Yeah, and that has been the historical trajectory of these. The last time we actually used a peace dividend was kind of in the late 90s, and 9/11 certainly put a stop to that, and it's been an upward trajectory ever since. I think that there's a sense that there's some level, and this is true certainly from the perspective of Congress, the level of military Keynesianism. Not that I'm supporting it, but there's this idea that spending all this money on military weaponry and supplies and things like that. Usually these suppliers are spread out across every congressional district, so that when you increase the Pentagon budget, that helps someone in Montana, that helps someone in Indiana, that helps someone in Iowa, and that's literally the way that defense contractors, particularly the big five prime integrators, that's the way that they cement their affinity within Congress.
Jennifer, in your most recent NDA episode, you also talk about the driver being the desire to spread, what do you call it? The World Trade?
I call it the World Trade System.
Yeah. Can you explain what that is? Because I think that every week we often talk about how military spending is up and this is bad and so voted for the new military budget and we don't like them for that reason. But as hard as it is to get enough pushback on domestic issues, which are easier arguably to wrap one's head around, sometimes I wonder if the conversation about increasing military budgets doesn't get more traction, or there aren't more opportunities for political consequences against Democrats who vote for these things, because it can seem like a little bit of an abstraction in terms of what the larger international goals here are.
Yeah, and I'm speaking from my own experience here, that it was about 100 episodes deep into my own podcast, years and years and years before I even started to see the big picture, because the way that they speak in hearings and in halls of power internationally, like the Council on Foreign Relations, Atlantic Council, Aspen Institute, these places, they're always talking about this rules-based international order, and they call it that, and it's based on democracy and human rights and rule of law and all this. But when there's actual organizations, when they're talking about the rules, I want to know which ones they're talking about. And they always seem to be talking about the World Trade Organization, World Bank, the IMF is, all up in this. And so, I'm someone who started my political awakening because of the Iraq War. Mm-hmm. And for me, it was like, why is my country going after Iraq? It was this nation-specific thing. And then it didn't make sense to me once I realized that we have bases in something like 100-something countries. We're all over the world. Didn't make sense to me. But now that I know that our goal isn't really to protect our country, but it's instead to help implement this economic system that is administered by the World Trade Organization, what they want to do is make that global, with the idea being that if every country is trading with each other, there will be no war. And they say this openly. I have the people that started this back after World War II speaking about it, to Condoleezza Rice, to Hillary Clinton. I mean, when they're with each other, these conversations are very clear, but they don't articulate this to us. And so when you see that there's this economic system that they want to be global, then it makes a lot more sense why we need so much money and why when you watch these hearings in Congress, they say, we don't have nearly enough. They talk as if the Defense Department's getting, cuts all the time and as if they never have enough money. Well, if the goal is to implement an economic system that a lot of countries don't want to be a part of, if that's the goal, then you can start to understand why they need $1 trillion a year. But if you're sitting here as an average American taxpayer thinking like, why do we need $1 trillion just to make sure we don't get invaded by other countries? Then it doesn't make any sense. And as soon as I started to understand that and was listening to their conversations as often as I do, then the money started to make sense. It's not that I agree with it, but once you can see the game that they're playing on an international scale, then you can start to understand their justifications for this because they think their system is the good system. The China-Russia system that's kind of being created is the bad system. And the members of both corporate parties, because when you look at the laws that are implemented through the World Trade Organization, these laws are really helping multinationals open markets around the world. So it really is, we talk about corporate power, we have two corporate parties that are devoted to helping this system. And they're ideological about it to the point that both parties, we talk about there being this partisanship in Congress, but I'm more concerned that they are in lockstep when it comes to this. And so it does make sense to me that these, especially corporate Democrats, are in support of these huge military budgets because they think that the greater good is making this economic system the global system, because they think that that's what's going to make the world a peaceful place, even though it takes all these wars to implement it.
And in recent years, I've heard pushback against this state of affairs coming from the far right, the far Trump right. And, Trump is someone who branded himself as anti-war. And, he famously went on stage during the early Republican primary debates and said, we lost the war in Iraq. It was a huge failure. We never should have freaking did it. And that struck a chord with a base of voters who were alienated by this exact bipartisan consensus that you and David are describing. And were thought to have been in lockstep with Bush and these, ballooning defense budgets and the us being the mall cop for global capital. And, I think a lot of that critique is just pandering, frankly, when I hear it from, these far right figures. And I'm wondering if either of you are familiar with any kind of pushback we're seeing from the left against that bipartisan consensus, against these defense, against the military spending on Capitol Hill.
Well, there was certainly disappointment expressed, people like Pramila Jayapal, Bernie Sanders, to increasing the defense budget. But I want to make a slightly different point, which is to talk about the assumption here was, well, we're increasing the non-defense discretionary budget, and that's the price that we have to pay for a higher defense budget. And it's just sort of to eliminate the historical amnesia here. If Biden's budget requests were taken as a whole for non-defense discretionary, that would equal about 3.3% of GDP. In 1980, on the cusp of the Reagan Revolution, that spending was about 5% of GDP. And that translates into hundreds of billions of dollars. So the idea that we have restored the non-defense budget to its former glory is just not true. It's just inaccurate. And we see this down the line, whether you're talking about the Department of Labor, whether you're talking about the EPA, whether you're talking about the IRS. It is not, in some cases, not as sufficient as where the budget was in fiscal year 2010 under the Obama-Biden administration. That's how much of a hole that we put ourselves into. And the Biden budget does not bring that back in a significant way. It does better, but it doesn't go all the way there. Now, there are obviously also these investments that are being made off budget, the infrastructure plan. There also, the devil is kind of in the details. We have a 25-page fact sheet. Jen doesn't have any bill to read right now because there is no bill. We have a 25-page fact sheet that has a tremendous amount of policy in it. But most of that policy is defined in one line or one paragraph. And there are just a number of different ways that those policies could go that we just don't have a good handle on. And it's going to take hammering that out through Congress to get to what we're actually going to get out of that. And there are a lot of ways that could go. And even if all the money is there, it could still go pear-shaped because it's not put towards the way of fixing the problem for the long haul or what have you. I mean, there are a lot of examples of this. We've done a series. We've looked at 10 different policies within the American Jobs Plan. We call it Building Back America. And just look at try to analyze what you could actually do within the confines of that program. A good example is orphan oil and gas wells. So there's money in the fact sheet to give $16 billion to cap all these orphan oil and gas wells that are abandoned by oil and gas companies, and they leak methane, very harmful, noxious pollution and greenhouse gases. And unless you engage in a concerted effort to bottle them up, that will continue. So 16 billion does not seem like enough, number one. And number two, typically how this is done is that the oil and gas companies pay for it themselves because they're the ones who actually created the problem and uncapped these wells and left them to rot and cause this harmful externality to go into the atmosphere. So unless you marry an orphan oil and gas well program, even if you want to devote federal money to hiring people to cap these wells, and those are good paying jobs, you have to marry that to a system that puts real penalties on oil and gas companies if they continue to abandon these wells. So that's something that needs to be part of the package. And that's just one of literally dozens of these policies that are embedded into the bill. So the jury is still out.
So yeah, I've detected in the discourse around the infrastructure bill, and like that announcement was about 2 weeks ago at this point?
2, 3, something.
Yeah, and we don't, like you said, we don't have a bill. We just have the fact sheet, the idealized version of it. And I've, detected from, left quarters, places like Sunrise Movement and, in the pages of Jacobin, a kind of, maybe a cautious optimism about it, because $2 trillion, that's a big headline number, right? And that would fit, where would that fit in like the pantheon of comparably sized packages, David?
Oh, it'd be significant. This is over 8 years, of course, and that's just part of it. And then you add in the family care and education part of this package, which is going to include apparently paid family leave and money for childcare and free community college.
These have been big left goals for a while.
Yeah, this is all one package, and you're talking about $3.5 trillion. And then there's a whole other part of it, which is the tax measures, which, I don't know that we necessarily need all of them, but they all do attempt to make a more equitable tax system and reduce the soaring inequality that we've seen. So it's really 3 parts, right? It's 3 different things that we're looking at here. And so this would be really, really significant just as a pure dollars and cents matter. But again, you need to know what we actually can do. Another perfect example that we wrote about is the 500,000 electric charging stations, the electric vehicle charging stations that are proposed to be put across America. What I did not know until I read this piece by one of our writers, Gabrielle Gurley, is that Tesla, for example, has a proprietary nozzle for charging its cars. And so does Rivian, the electric truck maker. And so do a lot of others. So if you're saying we're going to build 500 electric vehicle stations across America, how many different nozzles are they going to have to accommodate unless you engage in a process of standardization? Imagine if there were gas stations that only took Toyota, and then there were other gas stations that only took Hyundai. That's what this is like. And without standardization, you're going to be in a really bizarre situation. It's going to be more costly to put these things together. Everyone's going to have 3 or 4 adapters sitting in their car, and it's just not a sustainable situation. So there's another example of where you have to build in some policy into this beyond just the spending.
Jennifer, have you had a chance to look at these fact sheets or the fact sheets around the $2 trillion infrastructure bill?
I did actually, because I knew that you guys wanted to talk about infrastructure. I'm like, yeah, I'll look into the bill.
That's good. I'm glad that I mentioned
She's
that.
prepared.
Yeah. But the problem is it's just a fact sheet. And like David pointed out, there was no bill for me to look at. So like process wonk over here. We're talking about so many things. And David did a really good summary of all of it. And yet, if you look at the House Transportation Committee, they've had 2 hearings so far, and they were just generalities. I feel like every single one of these things deserves its own hearing. Every single one of these parts of these bills should be worked out in the committees. Our representatives should be involved in this. But instead, these conversations are happening at the White House. Like, the executive branch is not supposed to be writing legislation. And so, again, just like with the CARES Act and everything that happened last year, I'm seeing again that we have these huge bills that are being negotiated behind closed doors and not in the committees where they're supposed to be. And then I looked at the timeline. Nancy Pelosi wants to have all of this done by August. That is so fast. And it just tells me that the whole committee process is going to be skipped again. There's going to be a big bill that's plunked on the desks and people get to say, take it or leave it. You know, it's been worked out by leadership. You say yes or no. That's your only role here. And one of the things that's bothering me about, you know, the conversation in the Twitterverse is that this isn't a part of the conversation. No one's annoyed by this, it feels like, except for me. And I would really like to see us be more angry about the sidelining of the vast majority of our representation in Congress.
Here's the big question that I have for both of you. And, you know, there is the idea of a Green New Deal, right? And this is something that has been, you know, getting shaped for the past, you know, pretty recently, for the past 2 years that we've started using that terminology, and the outline of which being something like, we will have a federal jobs program. We will spend this money through the federal government, not through private contractors. We'll put people to work to turn our economy into 100%, turn our energy economy to 100% renewables. And, you know, meet the, you know, aggressive emissions targets that we have to meet to save the universe. And so, you know, some of the language, I think everyone wants to play nice right now. And some of the, you know, sounds that I've been hearing from, say, Sunrise, for instance, is, you know, okay, the Biden $2 trillion infrastructure package, which again, very, very big, that's a lot of spending. You know, this could be like a tentative first step. It's not the Green New Deal. It's still a lot of this spending is still nevertheless going to go through, you know, private contractors, our existing, you know, infrastructure. So like there's definitely profits to be had here. But nevertheless, you know, we would rather there be some spending along these lines than nothing. How would either of you evaluate that claim of how this stacks up to the Green New Deal? Do we think this is a tentative baby step in the right direction that maybe leaves the door open for more stuff? Or do you think this is going to be something like, all right, Washington passes some version of infrastructure spending and, you know, we say, all right, it's done. We're not talking about climate change anymore.
Well, I mean, the bottom line is that in order to get a bill like this passed, you need the buy-in of Joe Manchin, who literally in a campaign ad shot the Green New Deal. So the idea that you're going to get something that's appealing to the Sunrise movement out of a process that ultimately needs the buy-in of Joe Manchin is a little bit spurious. But let's look at it on its own terms. I mean, I do think that there's sort of a commitment to foreground climate in infrastructure in this bill. There's a renewable energy standard. There's money to continue various renewable tax credit programs. There's the electric vehicle commitment, which is not just the charging stations, but like a lot of money in-store rebates and things like that to build an electric vehicle manufacturing engine. It was interesting that the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has been talking about green infrastructure specifically in terms of competition with China. Mm-hmm. So they certainly see this as foregrounding. What it's ultimately going to look like, I mean, that's really the $1 million or $1 trillion question. And I think that there are other ways in which climate needs to be placed on the agenda, even outside of this. There are things that can be done through executive action, some of which have been taken, some of which haven't. There's an
which
Earth Day. There was this very ballyhooed pause on oil and gas drilling on public lands. It was actually a pause on permitting. It wasn't a pause on drilling. And what happened was at the end of the Trump administration, oil and gas companies got all their permits in.
Right.
And so there doesn't need to be any permitting, probably for a number of years. There are plenty of claims that oil and gas companies have on that land, and there's been no effort to stop drilling within that. Just as the Trump administration ended the Keystone XL pipeline, it hasn't ended things like the Line 3 pipeline, which is in the Great Lakes region. So there's it's good and bad. I mean, there's going to be pluses and minuses and all this stuff.
But Virgil, your question about the posture of the conversation about the infrastructure bill and the kind of mutterings from the Sunrise and environmental groups that this is a good first step, it feels like a sort of, manufactured consent. Because on one level, the things that are being done are far short of what the expectations were during the primary before Joe Biden was actually the candidate. Two, the justification for voting for Joe Biden was that it was in fact going to be the end of the world, and that if you didn't make these enormous spending outlays, that whatever incrementalism you were going to pursue wasn't going to be enough, and that there's cataclysmic downstream of costs to not addressing climate change in the moment. Three, as we just saw with the $15 minimum wage, which was the core promise that the Joe Biden administration made to Bernie Sanders upon his concession, and was one of the few, I guess you can call it progressive, but it's just mainstream, normal, everybody wants it, policies that he actually backed throughout without any pressure. That was supposed to be the gold standard, and we all know what happened with that. You can say you support it, but if you don't actually pass it and don't actually seem to support its passage, for all the reasons we talked about on this show, then it doesn't amount to much. So to have so much kind of cautious optimism, if you will, about the infrastructure bill generally and the climate impact specifically, especially given that we don't have legislation and we're so far out from understanding what the posture is going to be in terms of passage, it feels like a ruse. Am I being too cynical?
Well, I'm not sure because, I mean, again, like as David points out, we just have that fact sheet. And I do think it's important, I agree with you, Jennifer, about, going through the committee process that, largely what we're getting from the White House, like this is guidance. But I do think it's important that, the president is, ultimately, setting the agenda here and is like creating the outline of, what's going to happen, because there's no other totemic figure who's capable of doing that. No one else who's going to be basically held accountable in that fashion. And that's why I'm interested in, basically seeing how this infrastructure package measures up against Biden's campaign promises, against the stated expectations of the pro-Green New Deal left. Where we know he's not a socialist, but here's what our demands are. Here's where we want to push this whole process to, and frankly, the objective science, the scientific measurement of where we need to be. And it feels like and I open this question up to the whole panel here. It feels like we're falling short of all three of these measures, and that we're all kind of compromising with ourselves a little bit here.
Two quick things, maybe three, and I want to hear from Jen. Number one of the reasons why we decided we want to sort of pull apart the policies here was to get a handle on what the optimal policy will be, because ultimately with this fact sheet, you can't advocate for anything, right? Or activists can't, because it's amorphous. And so we wanted to just sort of look at these things as policies and figure out what would actually have the most impact. Number two, you're already seeing the negotiating with themselves. This is on the tax side, but you're, with things like the 28% nominal rate for corporate taxes already seemingly being pushed back down to 25%. It was 35% under Obama, and it was put back down to 21 under the Trump tax cuts. There's no way in which an increase in the corporate tax rate is going to pull in Republicans. They've already said that on the record. So moving from 28 to 25 does not bring in one single Republican vote. It's purely Democrats arguing with themselves as a caucus. The third thing is I just want to reiterate that point that Jennifer said about the real disenfranchisement of the vast majority of Congress. I mean, this is a little better than it was during the COVID era, or the beginnings of the COVID era. But Nancy Pelosi is essentially a one-woman Congress. I mean, she negotiates these bills. She puts them together behind closed doors. There's not a lot of transparency around them. They are handed over to members and told take it or leave it. There aren't hearings. I mean, the fact that these hugely consequential bills are being done in a room somewhere and there are no hearings on them whatsoever is really troubling. There should be just a litany of policy hearings right now just to inform members about optimal strategies. We should hear from experts.
And are there not rules? I'm sorry to be such a layman about this, but
no.
Who is deciding and why is what is like the rule infrastructure of how these things typically get done? Like, I mean,
there are none.
So typically it's just what convention. It's just whatever the speaker decides whether or not there's committee hearings on these things.
Well, because the speaker gets to decide really who is the chairman of the committees, and both parties have decided that it's going to be a pay-to-play situation for committee assignments, especially the chairmanships. So that's not decided anymore based on seniority or expertise. It's decided based on who fundraises the most for the party, and that's how they get their chairmanships. And so when you have that situation, these are people that have their power because of Nancy Pelosi. And so she really does dictate down upon high in the speaker's chair to tell these committees how they're going to operate. Now, they do have some autonomy in between, but like the House Transportation Committee is chaired right now by Pete DeFazio, who is, in my experience of watching him, he's a big fan of transportation, especially non-fossil fuel powered transportation. I like the guy. And yet, he's not doing what you would expect someone who's empowered to write something like a transportation bill. He's not having those hearings because he knows damn well that he's going to have to take whatever is handed to him and work with that. So it's completely backwards. It's supposed to be crafted in these committees and then go forward. And instead it's being crafted, like David said, in these behind closed doors situations and then going to the committees. It's the reverse of what I think us taxpayers are expecting to happen. But it's something that the Republicans and Democrats have decided together. They're going to normalize this behavior no matter who is in charge. This is how it's done.
It's just easier, right?
It's just easier.
Yeah. So
we're not demanding anything different. So I put a lot of this on us as the voters too. We should be angry about this. We should be aware about this. And as long as we're not even talking about it, they're going to continue operating this way.
I agree with that. I was talking to Congressman Jamie Raskin the other day for a piece that I'm working on. He said, what a culture shock it was coming to Congress. He worked in the state of Maryland in the legislature. And in the state of Maryland, every bill gets a hearing. Every single bill gets a hearing. And anyone can go and speak for 3 minutes on that bill. And sometimes he said they'd be there till 1 in the morning, 2 in the morning, taking testimony on these various bills. And when he got to Congress, he realized not only does not every bill get a hearing, and, I mean, there are thousands of bills, maybe that's to be expected, but exceedingly few bills get a hearing, like almost no bills get a hearing. It's almost completely reversed.
Well, maybe that works for the Maryland legislature, but these are the big leagues, buddy. I was going
to say it would be. It strikes me that this would be a kind of a cool thing to maybe have demanded of Nancy Pelosi. Yeah. When she had her back up against a wall earlier this year, and people were deciding what to ask of her in exchange for voting for her as Speaker of the House. Just throwing that out there. I know the fans love to hear me say it.
We're passing the 1 hour mark, and there were a few other things I wanted to get to. Of course, we have a great opportunity. We're sitting with two Congress experts here, Congress observers, and there's a couple other pieces of legislation that I know that everyone's thinking about. One is the PRO Act, which is the pro-union bill, makes it easier to join a union. This has been an ask of labor for going on 2 decades now, and it's something that famously the Obama could not pull off with a very, very big majority in both houses. And the news that just came down the pike is Joe Manchin just signed on to the PRO Act. I believe we're down to 3 holdouts in the Senate. What are the prospects for passing the PRO Act, which would be a very, very significant piece of pro-union legislation?
Nil.
Really?
It needs 10 Republican votes. There are no. I mean, the only way that you pass it is you get rid of the filibuster. And I've seen no indication that people like Manchin or Sinema are ready to do that.
So it's just
as long as that's
when Manchin signs onto it, it's just performative.
Yeah, I mean, it's a free pass. I mean, I think Manchin has a very close relationship with the mine workers. It's not necessarily the case that he would be against this. But functionally he is, because he's saying, I don't want to get rid of the filibuster. So, all the flowery language agreeing to it is kind of meaningless. I mean, what Schumer has said is that if it gets 50 votes, I'll put it on the floor. And that would be an advance to actually put the bill on the floor, but it's not going to get more than 50 votes. Who's going to vote? What Republican's going to vote for it? And so unless you either can have the current state of labor law as it stands today, where 6% of the private sector is unionized, and that statistic has been going down consistently since the 1950s, and a corporation like Amazon or others can completely union bust to their heart's content during an election and pretty much always win. And even if they lose, deny the collective bargaining agreement for years and years and push that down the road. So we can have that state where it's impossible to organize in America, or we can have the filibuster. And those are the two options.
I agree.
Same question with H.R. 1, the voting rights bill, probably the most significant piece of legislation when it comes to thinking forward to 2022.
They broke my heart with that in 2019. I'm still not over it because it's such a good bill. I love it so much, and I think it's so necessary, and it doesn't stand a snowball's chance in hell with the Republicans being the party of no. It's just...
H.R. 1 doesn't have 50 votes in the Senate, let alone 60. And everybody knows that, including the author. I mean, I talked to Jeff Merkley, who is the author of S1, which is the companion to H.R. 1. And I said, does this even have 50 votes? And he said, no, this would need significant more work. It's also kind of written for a 2019 reality when we're in the 2021 reality. There's a lot of stuff in there that doesn't really correspond very well, and the gerrymandering language could be much tighter. It was built as kind of a...
It doesn't seem
well,
like
I mean,
that
Jen's
much
read it.
changed.
I'm sure she can tell you a little bit more of this. But what I've read, it was built as sort of a messaging bill, and they threw a lot of different kinds of structures in there. And the way that it does, we'll talk about the gerrymandering things, and then maybe Jen can talk about other parts. But it requires independent redistricting committees, but it's extremely vague on what their directives would be. And this is by design because particularly members of the Congressional Black Caucus don't want to see their very safe districts broken up.
Yeah.
And so they deliberately, they did not put in a position, for example, that this should be proportional to the average vote in a particular state, that we should strive to make these districts similar. The Democrats and Republicans would get a similar share as they would if the statewide vote was taken and just divvied it up from there. That is not in there. It's extremely vague on what the directive would be to give to these independent redistricting commissions. And that makes it difficult to say what the impact would be.
Well, I found the same thing. So in 2019, they introduced it like on New Year's Day, and I spent that whole first weekend reading it because I was so excited about it. And I found it to be a messaging bill, and that seemed very obvious to me. But what they were promising at the time is that they weren't going to stop. And so what I thought would happen is that they would pass the whole package, and then they would take it piece by piece and fight for the things that were very popular. So I'll take one example, which is automatic voter registration. There's no one that I know in my life, Democrat or Republican, that thinks that when they pay taxes, that the government doesn't know where they live. So it's very easy. And the registration games are how the Republicans by and large, are doing their voter disenfranchisement shenanigans. So that one thing would make a huge difference. It's extremely popular. Make the Republicans fight against it if that's what they're going to do. And so that's the strategy that I thought I was going to see in 2019 and 2020. Take the messaging bill, pass that, but then break it up into a bunch of different pieces. They never bothered with that. And so we do have this chance again with HR1 and S1 to do that if it is demanded, which again, I mean, we're still in the messaging part. We're still passing S1 and HR1. But if we're not demanding these individual things be worked on their own, so it's like with the gerrymandering provisions, if that could have been taken out on its own, bring it into a committee, have these long hearings about it, perfect it, have good ideas, bring in experts. This is possible. This is how Congress is supposed to work.
As you know, Jen, there are parts of this bill that are just findings. There's something that says we have a finding that Republicans have tried hard to suppress the youth vote. And that's it. It's just like a whereas, yes, they've done that. There's nothing in the bill to actually, stop that. And there are several instances of this.
So as an example, though, what committee would be hypothetically responsible for drilling down in the way that Jennifer just described?
Well, this would go to Judiciary.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who is that?
I mean,
White House?
It might go to House Government Affairs and
House
Homeland Security and Government Affairs.
House Administration was in charge of the first one. They discharged it to 10 committees, and 2 actually got to touch it before it was passed in 2019. So 8 of them received the bill and just went like, but 2, it was Judiciary and Administration, got to have, I think they each had a hearing on it. So that was the thing. Like, it was just such a fake effort. And I'm getting really tired of fake efforts from the Democratic Party. And I'm just hoping we don't see that again.
There was an S1 hearing this year in, I believe, the Senate. It's not called administration, but it's Klobuchar's committee.
Yeah. But I felt so betrayed by that in 2019 that I'm ignoring it all this year because unless I see it broken up, like, I'm just not even entertaining.
Well, that's the thing too. I really like the point that you're making, Jennifer, that there isn't an accountability mechanism. Nobody's really asking for it. And while I would, a part of me is loath to say it's, individual members of the public's responsibility when there are all these interim people, members of the media who aren't making specific demands of X, Y, and Z, a committee member or committee chair that should be the one highlighting these, having committee meetings on this, whether or not it's members of our progressive elected community that have enormous platforms and could be drawing attention to the individual figures who aren't playing their role here. And obviously the whole political leadership at the top in the White House. But it's easier for the public to make those demands if we have at least some understanding of who it is that is responsible farther down the food chain, which is why I'm asking these questions, because, whether it's articles or podcasts or whatever that frame the issue in that way, I think it would be helpful to pull it out of the realm of abstraction and to start to engage from a more organizing perspective and connect the kind of gripes that we do on podcasts like these to the organizing that a lot of groups claim is not served by what happens on Twitter. And, these kind of conversations could start to connect the two if we do start to do reporting that makes clear who is responsible, or at least who is in the chain of responsibility, who we could start to be calling out by name and putting more pressure on, including on Twitter.
I mean, like David said, we have a one-woman House of Representatives right now. Right now, she is the focus of so much of my anger when it comes to the way the House is functioning. But it's not just her. It's really the Democratic and Republican parties, like I said, have decided together to normalize some really despicable behavior when it comes to process in Congress. And I actually did a whole episode a few years ago because I was just curious, is it possible to run outside of those two parties and win in the House? And it is. Like, you have to get signatures, and a lot of times the money is almost nothing. Like in Texas, it costs $500 to get on the ballot. So it's possible to run outside this system. And so when I just look at the overall, how do we fix this? As long as we're allowing committees to be determined based on funding for the parties, I don't know how we fix this without disempowering these two monopoly or co-monopoly, duopoly powers that we have in our Congress. I mean, they're just rotten to the core of how our Congress is functioning. And I don't know how we deal with that while continuing to vote within their system.
Well, when you say run outside, it's possible to run outside the system. Are you talking about people just running for Congress on a third party ballot line? Or are you talking about people who run as a Democrat or a Republican, but don't?
Neither. Just as a person. I'm a resident of this district. You can go as an independent. You get 3 words that you get to describe yourself in the party section, but you don't have to be in a party. So you can put your name on the ballot as a member of your community. Now, how do you get the community to know who you are and vote for you? I feel like that's the job that you have to do. But at some point, I just don't think that the party system, even third parties, I don't think are the solution here. I think at some point, especially with the democratization of communication that we have with the internet, I don't think we need the parties in particular anymore. And I mean, this is obviously my the dreams that I have, but when I look at the path to it, it's just like these two parties, just the way they function and the stuff they agree on. I just don't see us making major changes, at least until the leadership gets fired. But I mean, all the way down the line. I mean, if you're participating in this system of dialing for dollars and giving it to the parties for your committees and thinking it's okay, then you're a problem too.
Yeah, it's a real bummer we haven't had any good, solid opportunities to fire the leadership.
Well, so one of the reasons I started the podcast is I started having these crazy dreams, and I was having these delusions of myself being on the floor. How would I get there? And the thing that gave me hope that I didn't know, which tells you how bad our civics were in our education system, but I didn't realize that you can fire the entire House of Representatives every 2 years. And in Congress, the House is the one that has the power of the purse. They control the money. So really, every 2 years, we have the opportunity for a mass firing. And I feel like fire them all is such a nice little, 3-word thing that we could actually organize. And I don't really care who gets in there, because all you really have to do is get people in there that are dedicated to not participating in the system that the Democrats and Republicans have set up. It would be chaos, that's for sure. But at this point, I just feel like without scaring the bejesus out of the Democrats and Republicans and threatening their power, I don't know how we change this. I know it's not hopeful, but that's where my head is.
I don't know. I'm already seeing posters with Trump on it. You're fired to get a bipartisan investment in this project.
Trump did get elected for a reason. I mean, remember when he got up there in the Republican primary when we didn't think he could actually win? And he said, these people take bribes. And I know that because I bribe them, I liked that about Trump. It was hilarious. And then he became president and became all scary. But there is something to that. That was something that the Republicans really identified with in his anti-war stuff. And there's a lot of people on the left that I really identify with this whole idea that our politicians are being legally bribed with this campaign finance system. I say it all the time, but we are more united than we're told. And I just think that these two parties, they are the ones that are perpetuating this lie that we are totally separate. And I don't buy it anymore. And with the internet, I don't think we need them anymore.
You're speaking my vibes, Jennifer, a woman after my own heart.
Right. Wrapping things up here, one last question. We have talked about a whole bunch of legislation. We've talked about a lot of numbers here. What is, and I think the consensus right now is HR 1, the PRO Act. These are things that are DOA. What's the next big fight coming in on the congressional schedule?
Every year we have government funding. Sorry, David.
No, please. Sure. Government funding, which I actually suspect is going to end up being a rollover continuing resolution to the next year. NDAA gets passed every year. That's the authorizations, the policy bill. The funding itself might be a different story. That's in the appropriations. I would just say that as far as legislative reality, we are trapped in the logic of the filibuster, and until such time as we walk out of that trap, that's going to define really everything that is done and can be done in Congress. But, as I sought to work on and which everyone read and then promptly forgot in September of 2019.
I remembered.
There is a reality that goes beyond legislative action. And that reality is executive action. And it's based on existing statute that has already been passed. It doesn't have to go through Mitch McConnell. It doesn't have to go through Mitt Romney. It doesn't have to go through Susan Collins. And there is a tremendous number of potential actions that are really impactful that can be taken through these executive actions. And we have put up at our executive action tracker, prospect.org/EAT or EAT. So prospect.org/EAT, we've put them up. And if this is FDR, if this is someone who has decided that there will be no barriers to delivering for the American people, you would probably expect we put up 77 different discrete actions that the president can take. And you would expect that all of those would have been taken, because this is a president who's not content to wait, right? I believe 8 of the 77 have been taken at this point, the first 100-day point. Some of these require some more long-winded processes, and you have to go through administrative procedure to write new rules and things like that. But there doesn't seem to be a lot of action on the horizon for a number of these. Including things like canceling student debt, which they claimed was being done through a process.
Yeah, David, they have to have a committee.
Yeah, committee
to have a meeting to plan a committee, to have a thought process on whether or not he's even able to do it. David, he doesn't know if he can do it.
There's an Education Department committee and a Justice Department committee. And everyone got excited when he announced the Education Department committee, while forgetting that he had already announced the Justice Department committee. So you announce commissions in Washington when you don't want to do anything. I mean, that's the name of the game. So that's an example. Drug prices are another example. Actually, there was a resolution that came out with Senators Merkley, I believe, was the lead, on all of the different things you can do as the president to lower prescription drug prices. Legalizing marijuana, which is something that Chuck Schumer is a new convert to. But the president can do that on his own authority and has chosen not to. A whole host of things. And I get a little frustrated when we focus so much on the legislative action, when there's this whole universe of executive action that can be taken and there's a choice not to. The most consequential action we can take right now is to agree to the process at the World Trade Organization to remove the intellectual property requirements on vaccines, so that countries around the world can produce these things. And the Biden administration, among other large countries and developed countries in the developed world, have resisted doing that. And there's absolutely nothing else that can be done that is more important. Really, no legislative action. I mean, you're talking about forcing the world to wait months, if not years, if not a decade, to get the vaccine they need. That could create mutations. That could create an entire resumption of this virus. It is a major crime right now that we haven't put that forward. And that's not legislative action. That has nothing to do with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. So we got to keep our eyes on the prize here, and we got to focus on what it is Biden can do and whether or not he's doing it.
Well put. David, that counts as your plug, because you plugged the American Prospect Tracker.
I plugged about 17 different things, so I appreciate your indulgence.
And
Jennifer?
I'd like to just frustrate David for one more minute, bring it back to legislation if I can.
Okay.
Because instead of looking at what the next battle is, I actually see that we have an opportunity this year in government funding, because I have seen something I call the dingleberry method used for evil many, many times, which is that government funding is must-sign legislation. It's the one thing that you can count on every year that's going to get signed, whether it's continuing resolution or 7 continuing resolutions or actual government funding. And it's an opportunity to stick stuff to it and have it hitch a ride into law. It's used all the time to do things that wouldn't become law otherwise if the public didn't know about it. We can also use it for stuff like, I don't know, increasing the minimum wage to $15 an hour.
Impossible. Jennifer, haven't you heard that because it's a must-pass bill with COVID relief in it, it means you can't actually attach anything to it or it would fail, and that would negatively reflect on the people who are trying to pass the good thing that everybody wants, a $15 minimum wage, instead of the evil henchmen who are blocking it. Haven't you heard the must-pass bill only means you can put horrible things like welfare reform and junk through?
I've seen treaties become law this way. There's all kinds of stuff, but it is something that I just feel like people that want to make the world a better place should be aware of the strategy. Now, I am a little wary of even saying this out loud because the Tea Party has used it, threatened government shutdowns for stuff that we're not happy about, and government shutdowns have serious consequences. So I think it's a power we have to be very careful if we want to wield, but it's there. And so government funding, because it will be signed, it's an opportunity every year. And I think we should just be aware that that's coming. And technically it's coming by September 30th, but usually it comes like 3 days before Christmas so that there's pressure to you have to sign this, you have to vote for it now so we can all go home for Christmas. Like that happens every single year. So, but I see that as the next opportunity. And as for the infrastructure bill, I mean, one of the things that makes me feel like it might actually happen is they've brought back earmarks. Jack Abramoff, of all people, was the one who told me that if you bring back earmarks, you actually have a chance of getting more legislation into law, because you can say okay, we'll give you a bridge in return for your vote for this bill. And here we're literally talking about infrastructure. So where I do have hope, that's where it lies with those two bills that will infrastructure will put a maybe that it'll be law, but government funding definitely will.
David and Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on, giving our audience this very smart update about what's going on Capitol Hill. And quickly, Jennifer, where can people find you and your show?
Well, thank you for asking. The show is called Congressional Dish. You can find it anywhere that podcasts are found. And then I just also want to note that because who am I? No one knows. So I think it's important to earn people's trust. So everything that I say in my show, I have very detailed show notes with timestamps and transcripts of all the sound clips. And I give you all my articles, everything that I use. David, your work has definitely appeared in my show notes. So it was very nice to meet you. But yeah, congressionaldish.com is where you can find the show notes, links to Patreon and all that stuff.
Now, you will find that in the notes of this episode. And for anyone listening, just before you get any ideas, we are not going to do all that stuff Jennifer just said. If we mention an article, you have to track it down. You got to learn how to use a friggin' search engine, because I'm just not doing that. And David, David, you have to use your Breeze Yahoo search toolbar. And David, all right, I'll give you one more little plug. Where can people find you your work?
Just prospect.org, on Twitter @DDayen. I'm around.
Thank you both.
Thank you both so much.